thereafter. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar for Digitised AIFMD Annex 4 reporting. My name is Mike Chambers. I head up the Prudential team here at Centralis in our governance, risk and compliance division. For anyone who is new to Centralis, the GRC division, as we shorten it to, is responsible for servicing clients in respect of accounting and tax and prudential compliance advice and more or less everything in between. We focus primarily on the alternative investment sector, both in the UK and across Europe, and indeed servicing some more international entities as well, to the extent that they have a requirement arising in the UK or the European Economic Area. Centralis more broadly has offices around the world, servicing special purpose vehicles and other corporate structures with a range of corporate services, including accounting and legal advice, as well as anti-money laundering, consulting, and fund directorship type roles as well. So if any of that information, that's obviously a very quick summary, but if there's anything that anyone on the call would like to explore further, then by all means reach out to one of the contacts you have here at Centralis, and there'll be some contact information at the end of this session as well. So back to the session at hand. The goal for today is to run through some of the nuances of Annex 4 reporting. There'll be a bit of a technical overview, and my goal here is not to run through the forms on a line-by-line basis. I don't think there's an awful lot of demand for that sort of for that kind of detail. However, should anyone have any specific questions, then happy to either deal with them as a point in this session, or indeed pick it up afterwards as well for anything that's particularly nuanced. The technical nature of this will be running through the various different overarching reporting requirements, how they differ across the various different jurisdictions, and essentially how best to make the most of the various of the different synergies that you can achieve across the board. I'll then go through some of the back-end automation that's possible with a bit of upfront work, and what we found with that, as I'll go through in a bit more detail later, is that kind of takes quite a lot of the manual effort out of extracting information from the fund data that you have to be able to report for the various different data points in the reports. So hopefully that'll be a bit of a tip as to how to better work or minimize the amount of disruption caused by the various different reporting requirements. And then finally, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Alex Prentice, who I hope you can see on screen as well, who will go through how we at Wheelhouse see the benefits of digitizing user interfaces and improve the sort of not only the customer experience, but also the way in which we run through each of our workflows, achieve greater transparency, and essentially ensure everything is done in a timely and transparent manner. So that's the running order. We're likely to go for approximately 40 to 45 minutes or so. If we finish earlier, then that's a bonus, of course. There's a chance we may go longer depending on any queries that come in. And to that end, if you do have any questions, you should at the top of your screen see either at top or the bottom see a control panel for Zoom, which allows you to open the Q&A panel. If you open that, you can submit any questions, and I'll see them on screen up here on my left. So if you see me glancing up there, it's only to check how we're doing in terms of questions coming in. Yeah, anything of any nature as we go through, please do ask. So kicking off then with a technical overview. Hopefully, if you're dialed into this webinar, then it's probably because you either are involved in the Annex 4 reporting process, or because you're going to be involved in it, whether it's from a completion or a review point of view. The rest, this section is really intended to make sure that your firm is adhering to all of the various different obligations in the right way, because on the face of it, from the relevant rules, it's not entirely clear how firms are supposed to kind of pick through all the various different requirements and make sure they're doing everything completely correctly. First thing to talk about would be the types of managers and funds that are affected by the rules, and where those types of funds are required to be reported. This has become increasingly more nuanced since the UK left the European Union, because of course the rules under AIFMD were set in place long before that happened, and the UK has onshored those rules to the extent that it's more or less carried forward as it was. But with a few slight nuances as well, and also now that the UK is treated as a third country as far as the European Economic Area is concerned, there's a little bit more to think about. So just running from left to right, and in each column, in each silo there, from top to bottom. And at this point, I think you might be able to sort of self-identify your firm in this whole diagram here. But first of all, let's deal with a EEA fund manager. If the EEA fund manager has funds which are managed from the EEA, and for the funds that the manager is managing from the EEA and not marketing anywhere else, you need only report to your EEA home state regulator. That's one of the benefits of being a manager in the EEA. You don't need to report to all of the various different jurisdictions in which the funds are marketed. That changes though if one or more of the funds are marketed into the UK. Technically, there either is or will be a requirement for those funds to be reported in the UK. There were some transitional marketing provisions in play post-Brexit. Those are starting to run out, so the FCA will in due course start requiring firms to report their funds that are marketed from outside the UK into the UK via Reg Data, their reporting system. So that's EEA fund managers. Then you have UK fund managers, which is pretty much the opposite, really, the opposite of what we just spoke about, i.e. for any funds that are simply managed from the UK and not marketed anywhere else, you report to the UK. For any funds that are marketed into the EEA, the obligation becomes increasingly more vast, in that you have to report to every jurisdiction in which those particular funds are marketed. So you don't get the benefit of reporting to one EEA regulator. It has to go to every single one to which it is reported. And actually, just given the nuances with Brexit and the timeliness with which certain regulators apply new rules, this has taken a little bit of a patchwork kind of implementation pattern, if you like, i.e. certain regulators like the Netherlands and in the Netherlands and in Luxembourg already require UK managers to report to their jurisdiction. Others, where they're slightly slower to implement new requirements, or indeed are less proactive in reaching out to firms that are not adhering to their requirements, there's been less of a requirement to report there. But I would certainly say, in theory, that's what's required across the board, and it comes down to each regulator as to whether they require and or enforce that requirement. So the final category would be any type of firm that is outside the UK or EEA. Until Brexit, that would have been just a third country AIFM, but now we have these sort of three different flavors. And essentially, you have a requirement to report in every jurisdiction in which you market. The reason I've separated the UK out there, it will become a bit clearer on some future slides, but essentially it's ever so slightly different to report to the UK than it is to the rest of Europe now. But you essentially have to, if your manager is outside the EEA and UK, you report everywhere in which those funds are marketed in those relevant jurisdictions. So that's who has to report and where you have to report. The next thing to mention is around the reporting content, or what to report. The manager doesn't send any information about the management entity itself. When we talk about the AIFM report, we refer to a degree of static data that's pretty regular and unchanging quarter by quarter. And then we report some exposure concentrations. Those are things that are data points that are aggregated across common characteristics. And what we look at here is an aggregation of all of the underlying AIF reports that are being submitted to each jurisdiction. So it's nothing new compared to the AIF reporting, it's just an aggregation across all of the funds. So that's why that looks relatively straightforward, because it is once you've done the AIF reporting. On the AIF reporting side, you have three content bubbles, if you like. That's maybe the easiest way to think about it. And we'll come on to who has to report those specific bubbles on the next slide. But just to give a bit of an overview as to what we mean by each of those boxes. Static data, I think, is fairly straightforward. That's the stuff that, you know, the unique identifiers, the type of fund that you are, the prime brokers that you have, the strategy that the fund deploys, that kind of thing. Actually, there's a separate box for strategy there and prime brokers that we also have to report the share classes. Those obviously do change over time if it's appropriate for that particular fund structure. But those are the sorts of things that all funds will have to report. We then go into some exposure concentrations, which, like the AIFM report, are those aggregated summaries, if you like, that are common, aggregated by common characteristics. So report the top 3 exposures to particular marketplaces, or report the top 5 exposures to a particular sub-asset type, that kind of thing. So we're not disclosing instrument names or instrument counterparties. It's purely aggregated and anonymized information. So if you're lucky and you only have to report what we call Article 24.1 content, then that's the extent of what you have to include. If you have to report Article 24.2, and we'll come on to what might trigger that, then there's a little bit more detail to go into. You have to report individual exposures by a sub-asset type. So you're still not saying the name of the instruments themselves, but you are summarizing or aggregating the long and short positions in each sub-asset type. So, for example, unlisted equities in financial institutions, or G10 bonds with a less than 1 year maturity, something like that. That it goes down to that level of detail. The goal being that that breakdown should equate to the overall assets under management that the fund is reporting. We have to report the turnover for the reporting period. So if you're reporting quarterly, then we aggregate everything across the quarter. Semi-annually, it's across the 6 months. And if it's annually, then we have to look at the whole year's worth of activity. But here we're looking at the value, the cost of purchasing assets or derivatives, or whatever instrument type it is, and the proceeds from selling. For any cash transactions, that's pretty plain and simple, but for derivative transactions, we need to use the notional value there. And what we do is, rather than present a net figure of proceeds minus costs, we're aggregating those two types of transactions in absolute form. So we're presenting a gross number of turnover within the portfolio. Currencies is fairly straightforward. Every instrument will have a denominative currency. So we aggregate the various different currencies across their long and short positions. Once again, that should add up to the total assets under management of the fund. There's some risk analysis to do, and there's 7 preset risk types, the typical ones, including VAR or net equity delta or Vega, for example. If those types of risk measurements are relevant for your type of fund, then it makes sense to report the data that you have. If they're not relevant, those fields have hitherto been optional fields. They are changing by Q3, I believe, this year, to be mandatory fields. So you'll need to include data which, if they're not relevant, then it will be a 0 and then an explanation as to why it's 0. Liquidity profiles extend to the liquidity of the portfolio, the liquidity of investors, and the liquidity of any borrowing that the fund has. And that's split down into buckets typical buckets would be less than 1 day, 2 to 7 days, 8 to 30, and so on, all the way up to greater than 360. And that we just have to report the percentages of each of those various different buckets for as to how that breaks down into the 100% of the 3 different things that we're analysing. Investor information would be a couple of things. One would be to break down the overall NAV by investor type. So whether it's general government or insurance companies or financial institutions, individuals, we need to assign each investor a category and present the percentage, aggregated percentage of that category in the breakdown. The other thing we need to do is tell the break those investors down by retail versus professional. In many cases, you see very few retail investors inside alternative investment funds, given that in many jurisdictions they're seen as not suitable for retail investors. But you do get some, particularly third country AIFs, where there are retail investors involved. And the final thing is to aggregate the percentage holding of the 5 largest investors and report that as a data point as well. Controlled structures is relevant for private equity style funds. So if the fund has an investment in, let's say, a special purpose vehicle that has itself its own substructure and perhaps even deploys a degree of borrowing to leverage its investments, then there's some information to report about those structures if the fund itself has dominant influence over those controlled structures. And then finally, stress testing. The Article 15 of the AIFMD requires AIFMs to conduct appropriate stress testing on not only the NAV but also the liquidity. So there's 2 free text boxes to include the results of that stress testing. That is only applicable to EEA or UK AIFMs, because those types of firms are fully subject to the AIFMD. If you're a third country AIFM, you need not conduct that stress testing, so you can leave those boxes empty if that's a preference. So that's Article 24.2. That's the real kind of meaty part of the report. That would be, I'd say, about 80% of the overall content that you'd need to report in there. So if for any reason you don't need to report that section, then most firms choose not to, simply because it reduces the amount of reporting required. The final thing to go through on here is the Article 24.4. That's only going to be applicable for funds that are significantly leveraged. So that's where you calculate your assets under management on a commitment basis, and that's not the same thing as committed assets for a closed-ended fund, for example. This would be where you are netting short positions against long positions and finding a sort of net AUM value. If you divide that number by the NAV and it comes out more than 3 times the NAV, then that's significant leverage, and that triggers Article 24.4 reporting. So that's the reporting content, what to report. We can then go on to how you determine what the content should be. The good thing is that for managers, the content is always the same, and it's a relatively short 1-page report, so that's quite handy. For funds, there are a number of different criteria, and there's a whole flow diagram that helps firms to determine what the reporting content should be based on the characteristics of their fund. We've tried to summarize it here, but there will naturally be nuances to various different fund structures that warrant some more detailed analysis. But just running through a sort of the more simpler examples, funds can restrict themselves to only reporting Article 24.1, i.e. that relatively straightforward section that I highlighted on the previous slide, if they meet one of 3 main criteria. One is that if their AUM is below 500 million, that threshold is available to funds that are entirely unleveraged and deploy lock-ins of at least 5 years based from original investment to investors. If you can't meet those two criteria, then that threshold drops to 100 million. So either one of those two thresholds might apply depending on the fund. And then the third one is if the fund is unleveraged and invests in private companies or issuers in order to acquire control. So essentially a private equity fund, but they have to be taking a controlling interest in the investments. So if you can meet one of those three criteria, then you don't have to do anything more than Article 24.1. Going down to B in that list, 24.2 comes online if you exceed either of those two thresholds above, A or B. I.e. if you go above the 100 or the 500 million there. And then Article 24.1 and 2 and 4 come online when the fund is significantly leveraged. As I said earlier, commitment AUM is greater than 3 times the net asset value. The only thing that is worth mentioning that isn't on the slide is that marketing can also impact the level of content you have to report. For example, if you have a non-EEA or a non-UK fund, and it is not being, whilst it's managed from the UK or EEA, if it's not marketed into the EEA or the UK, then you don't need to do Article 24.2 at all. So it'd just be Article 24.1 and maybe Article 24.4 if it's a significantly leveraged fund. So Article 24.2 does not apply when the funds are not marketed into the UK or EEA. So that's the reporting content piece. Just a quick highlight on post-Brexit changes to the reporting, and this is where the two reporting frameworks have started to deviate. For the UK, this is any references to ESMA have been removed, as you might expect. Assets classes have been rebased to reference the UK instead of EU. So there's certain bond investments that refer, in the ESMA reporting, they refer to EU bonds, whereas in the UK reporting, they refer to UK and non-UK bonds. So that's something to keep an eye on, because if you have to report to both the UK and the EEA, you're going to have to do 2 sets of analysis or 2 sets of tagging of those various different asset classes. And then finally, on the geographical analysis, that has also been rebased in the UK reporting to refer to UK and then Europe brackets non-UK, whereas the ESMA reporting talks about Europe EEA versus Europe non-EEA. So again, if you're reporting to both recipients of the data, then there's 2 sets of analysis to be done. But thankfully, that's pretty much it in terms of changes. Otherwise, the reporting remains relatively harmonized. Reporting frequency then, this also talks about similar thresholds as the reporting content. But again, the flow diagram that I mentioned earlier does it's a whole page in and of itself, and with several different strands to it. So it's worth doing the full analysis if you're unsure as to whether or not the correct reporting frequency has been applied. But we can run through some of the more common examples that we see, and actually the same thresholds here, i.e. the 500 million, where the fund is unleveraged and applies initial lock-in of 5 years, at least 5 years. Or where those criteria don't apply, 100 million, or that same third criteria where all funds are unleveraged private equity funds, your reporting frequency can be annual if you fall below all of those. Semi-annual where you go above those thresholds, and if you go above $1 billion in aggregate across your funds, then the manager has to report quarterly. On the fund side, exact same threshold criteria. The one exception is that if any individual fund goes above that 500 million mark, then it must report quarterly. Whereas where all the other funds and the manager may, well, particularly if the fund, if the aggregate AUM is below $1 billion still, the others may still be on semi-annual reporting. So you could have this mismatch where you've got one particular fund reporting on a quarterly basis, and then the other funds and the manager reporting on a semi-annual basis. So if it's helpful to minimize the workload and get that right, then it's worth doing the analysis. Just a bit of an indicator of the reporting timeline. I won't go through it in lots of detail, just maybe one to have as a reference point for going forward throughout each year. Just to note though that the any funds that are registered with the appropriate regulator as a fund of funds, they get an extra 2 weeks to do their reporting. So just simply because that typically is when the data becomes available to the manager itself. So there's a little bit of extra time for fund of funds. Otherwise, they're typically 1 month after each quarter end and on calendar quarters. So that's the technical detail. As I mentioned, I'm not going to go through each thing line by line, but hopefully there's a few useful pointers in there so that if you were to either prepare the next round of reporting for the end of June coming up, or if you're going to be reviewing that, have those things in mind as to whether or not the reporting is being done completely, and also whether it's being done accurately. And once again, if any questions arise, feel free to reach out for any assistance there. I can't see any questions coming in on the Q&A thing just yet, but we are about to move on from the technical content. So if there are any queries, now's the time to post them in there. I shall keep an eye on it, and if there's any that do pop up, I'll stop and come back. So approaches to reporting then, no doubt we've got a fairly broad representation of different approaches from people dialed in to the webinar. I'm going to run through a few of what we see firms typically doing. First option, pretty straightforward, complete the work in-house. Fairly common approach, particularly for new funds or indeed large asset managers that have multiple funds. It's sometimes most appropriate to keep those things in-house and keep all the reporting lines internal. Secondly, fund administrators will tend to offer the reporting service as part of their overall package, and of course they typically generate the data, so understandably that's quite a common solution to funds reporting requirements. You can use a software provider. That was typically quite a common approach when the AIFMD first mandated this reporting requirement, because firms didn't know how to interpret the data or how to convert that data to the appropriate reporting language. And so software providers who were quick to market on generating solutions were usually the first port of call in terms of a solution for that. And then finally, one that's become a little bit more prevalent as the AIFMD has matured and as the Annex 4 reporting obligation has become more clearly defined and perhaps more nuanced as well. There are specialist outsourcer firms available, of which we are one. So I will do my best to represent each of these various options objectively, but of course each has their own pros and cons. So running through the various different things that firms should be thinking about when deciding the best approach. Of course, internal resourcing, the challenges are common across the question, whether it's Annex 4 reporting or anything essentially. This is a particularly peaky requirement, i.e. at most it comes up once a quarter, and it can be quite a drag on people's time and resources during that period of time after the reporting date. So firms tend to find that it's hard to find suitably experienced individuals that have the capacity to be able to drop everything else at that particular point in time. The other challenges, of course, include access to the data, ensuring that you have sufficient a sufficiently broad team to quality assure and review, and also just keeping on top of any changes across the various different regulatory frameworks across Europe and the UK can be a little bit of a challenge sometimes. So outsourcing is naturally somewhere that firms like to go. From our point of view, it's not a service that we ever really thought we would actually get into when the AIFMD first came in. We assumed it would be a data exercise, and therefore one that either firms themselves or indeed fund administrators would take care of. As it developed and pretty quickly after the requirement came in, it was pretty clear that number one, the software that firms were being sold was perhaps not suitable for the level of support they needed, either because it had poor functionality, or indeed what they really needed was some expert consulting or expert advice on how to interpret certain data points and apply that to the instruments and information within the funds. So having access to that, the right level of outsourced service provider is a useful thing to have in mind. Also in terms of fund administrators, the one, of course, that being the generators of the data, you tend to find that they're the ones that are most familiar with everything, which is great in terms of streamlining from production of the final NAV pack through to submission to the various different regulators. What we've found, and purely anecdotally, is that those reports tend not to be, or have potentially been less in line with what the requirements ask for, and so we've done a lot of remedial work with firms that have come to us and said, we've been doing this reporting for some time, we're not sure of its accuracy, can you review it? And upon review, we found things that need to be corrected, and so we've had to do sort of historical resubmissions. So it's possible that that's just because it's not a core service for those types of outsourcers, one that they have to do as part of their service, and that's essentially where we came in. Thought to ourselves, this is something that is technically nuanced, requires technical input, expert interpretation of the rules compared to the fund in question, and one that requires project management from quarter to quarter. So requisitioning the data, processing it all, providing easy to use and easy to review reports, and upon a pre-agreed timeline, make sure that's all done in a timely fashion so that everything gets over the line. So that's essentially where, and I said I would try and remain objective, but of course that's naturally where we see ourselves fitting into the industry. The only other thing to point out, and not that we race to the bottom as such, but we've found, again anecdotally, that because it's part of a bundled service offering from fund administrators, it's possible to achieve some significant cost savings by outsourcing to a specialist service provider who's invested in making their processes efficient and price accordingly. So that's the sorts of things that we see firms considering when whether or not to outsource to any type of service provider. Just very quickly on the way, just to give a bit more flavour to the way we approach the reporting obligation. I appreciate it's not necessarily going to be entirely relevant to everybody on the call, but it might be useful in terms of taking hints and tips away. But of course, if you like what you see and want to discuss it further, then that's obviously an option as well. So this is all we've developed our service offering based on things we see happening in the market that we think could be done better. So firms, ideally, if you engage a software provider, what you're going to get given is a template to complete, which doesn't really save you any work based on, you may as well have just completed the form, for example. So when we work, we we work from the core records that have been prepared as part of investor reporting or internal nav packs that are subject to internal approval and for internal information. So that saves the completion of any kind of templates for us to use. We manage the timeline internally here, so we'll ensure that any team deployed on any work is able to deliver by a pre-agreed time frame, so that our client has sufficient time to review and doesn't go up to the deadline, deadline time on the deadline day, sort of thing. We prepare bespoke reports for each client, so you don't get reams and reams of PDF whenever you have one fund to report. Everything's presented side by side, easy to compare both fund to fund and easy to compare quarter by quarter, for example. So it makes that review process a little bit easier. We obviously do all the hard work in keeping up to date with the rules. Any nuances as they emerge from any regulator across Europe, which it does happen on fairly frequently, that's all taken care of by us. We have a pretty broad view of the way in which the industry approaches the reporting, so we deploy that across our client base in terms of best practice. And once everything's all sorted, we take care of the validation, conversion, submission to the various different regulators. And as you may be aware, the various different regulators across the EEA have very, very disparate systems. So it's I think it's perhaps helpful to not have to go through each of those and learn a different process each time. So it's all looked after on our side. This slide simply brings a lot of that together. You'll get the slides after the session, so hopefully you will see a pretty broad outline of the way we typically work, but at a very high level, we collect the data, whether that's from our client or whether it's from third-party providers. We conduct our analysis and send that information back to the client for review. That then is subject to review and approval, and once we have that, we can then go away and do our technical work in terms of validating and converting using software, generating the XML files that are required by each jurisdiction for submission, and then we go after the various different regulatory portals and send that off. So that's hopefully just a visualization of how we currently work. So a bit of a case study, just to bring that to life slightly. We had and this has happened on a number of different occasions, but we had a client come to us with highly complex funds with lots of different strategies, lots of different funds, lots of different managers, in fact, and needed and lots of different administrators that were providing lots of different data on different timelines. So the challenge for them is likely to be pretty clear, that there was just too much going on, needed a centralized point of contact to manage the whole thing. So we've taken that to into our remit, and now our team looks after that particular client. We have various different points of contact at that client where we pre-agree what the timeline looks like. We've learned how they like the reporting to be done, or how it should be done in line with the rules, and everything works at least as far as the client is concerned. What they see the first time they see anything is the draft report that we've prepared, because we've gone off and spoken to the fund administrators, we've gathered the data, we've done our work, we've interpreted it based on the pre-agreed ways in which they should be interpreted. And so they've seen a draft, they've taken a look at it, it's easy to review, as I mentioned earlier, provide approval, and then the next thing they hear from us is a confirmation that submission has been done. So it all works very well, and I think the upside for the client has been fairly dramatic, frankly, because beforehand they were getting a significant amount of paper work every single time they had to do any reports. We managed to, as I mentioned, that custom formatting that we've done helps for not only to reduce the amount of time and effort in review, but it actually makes that review a lot more valuable as well, because you're comparing vehicle side by side, and you're comparing quarter by quarter as well. It also helped to reduce their costs, because they were paying 7 different administrators their fee, which came as part of a bundle. So they've managed to carve that out of the costs that they pay to those various different administrators, and they pay us, but that is much less than the combined total of what they were paying from before. So that's been going very, very well, and it's been growing. And so I think, and this is just one example, but if it might be worth considering that if you're either have been doing the reporting internally, or have been outsourcing using software, for example, might be a good time to rethink as to whether or not that's the right approach. And perhaps if a specialist service provider might be a more productive way of working. This particular example was necessary from the client's point of view, because they were going through an expected planned period of extreme fast growth, essentially. So they were already observing that the process was a little bit unmanageable. So making sure that problem was solved before the growth happened was essential, and we were aware of what their plans were. So we've grown the team and our ability to service it as the fund structures have grown. So it's all very scalable, but all very manageable as well. So that's enough from me. What I'll do now is hand over to my colleague Alex to talk a little bit about the way in which we have invested in the back end of our system to help to kind of automate the data extraction process. And I think it's worth noting that it's been very productive for us, but I'll let Alex go through the details. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So I'll touch on exploring the automation in a bit more detail. I'll be doing a Chris Whitty bit as well, because Mike's still controlling the slides. But yeah, just wanted to start with where things were really, and why we went down this road. So like a lot of service providers in our space, we had relatively manual processes that were both specialized and time consuming. So a situation where our subject matter experts are being deployed on client work because nobody else can do it without risking the quality of our outputs. But then there's an obvious knock-on effect cost-wise of having those experts effectively doing those types of tasks. So we stepped back a bit and looked at how to use technology to standardize and simplify that process. And the aim is to speed it up, allow our team to apply their expertise to areas in the process that really benefit from human oversight. And we ended up building a system that can ingest data in its raw or source format. You heard Mike saying that clients no longer have to fill out templates, which ultimately is a duplication of effort. If you've gone to the trouble of creating the data on your side, it's a bit of a mislead to say, oh, this template is going to make your life easier. You're still going to have to sit there and plug the data in. Or if that data is being received from a fund admin, there's no waiting for a third party to complete their obligation. To help simplify things even further as well, we've built archetypes so that the onboarding process itself is simplified. So sort of carving up clients as we see them into buckets, if you will, and understanding what sort of assumptions might underpin any given client that we can verify later. And ultimately, we've reached a point now where we've achieved about 50% efficiency gains, with scope to increase that towards our stated goal of 75%. We've always been very confident that our outputs are best in class. We've got specialized teams, which isn't necessarily true where you've got multi-channel providers, that's sort of the bigger providers out there, or some of the fund admins. And we're now seeing that our costs are, as Mike alluded to, 50% lower than those admins and other competitors as well. So quite a pleasing place to have found ourselves. In the broader sense, if we knock on to the next slide, please, Mike. We've spoken around some of those back-end improvements, what they've achieved. Being able to reduce risk by using source data, removing the potential for human error as well while that data is being extracted and manipulated and then shared. We do still have quality control from the experts, making our commitment to excellent outcomes the same as it always was. Turnaround times are quicker, typically finding that we now move as fast as our clients are comfortable with. So, we're the ones saying, okay, job done our side. Let us know when you're ready to move on with the process. Something that brings all of that to life, though, all of those back-end improvements, is our commitment to improving the way our clients interact with us. And that's in the front end. So we've invested in a market-leading client portal. We've worked with a team that's led by the founder of WebEx. For some of those who remember what life was like before Teams and Zoom, WebEx was one of the first video conferencing suites out there, and a very successful business indeed. So we're working with a tried and tested group to introduce a portal that focuses on ease of use and collaboration and transparency. And there's a backdrop there as well, because of the industry we're in, that we've ensured that all of the activities and interactions within the portal are being documented automatically within a very safe and secure environment, and they're fully auditable as well. So for senior managers, that provides an additional layer of support in the context of the SMCR regime, for example. We can run an audit search that tells us who sent a given file or said a certain thing, timestamps it in the way that the FCA would want, their sort of time machine terminology. So if they do happen to knock on your door in the future, we've got this sort of in the background ready to say, okay, great, we can help out by saying, given date, given people, what happened there then. So what you can see on the screen there, aside from the boxes outlining some of what I just talked around, is a login page for the portal. So I'll just, if we knock on to the next slide, so show you what happens once you log in. So, we've taken the approach that it should function the way that any other leading organizations would go about their business. I think most of us are used to the world of apps for everything. And being able to switch seamlessly between platforms is key. So we've got the mobile version, which you can see on screen, some sort of screenshots of what that looks like. There's also a desktop version, which you'll see in a second. But the mobile version we've found tends to be predominantly used for messaging between our consultants and their clients. There's sort of a WhatsApp type feature in there for chat, but also for clients to check the status of workflows. So you get transparency on that, which I'll touch on, and to view reports. So it's the sort of thing that you might be doing on the fly, either before a meeting, you need to grab some MI, or you're on the train, you're thinking, oh, yeah, I need to check that before I crack on with something else. So that's the mobile side. Next slide shows us what the desktop looks like. And again, anecdotally, desktop comes out, the big keyboard comes out for the bigger jobs. So sharing files, analyzing things, we can do video calls through this as well. But that's kind of really where it comes into its own. So the next slide is, bringing it back slightly to Annex 4 as well, showing you what I mean by the ease of use and transparency. Within the desktop, this is the view that a client has when they're looking at an Annex 4 workflow with us, for example. There's a range of services that we're providing to this particular client, and each service has its own workflow, which in turn has a dedicated team set behind it. So again, security key, but also transparency, making sure we know who's on what. And this is the beginning to end workflow with a visual showing who's responsible for undertaking each item. So each step comes with simple instructions, and the execution can be done directly within the portal, whether that's sharing a file, signing off on something with an e-signature if need be, or just acknowledgement. There's a chat pane to the right for any questions or comments, and all of that's mirrored in the mobile app as well. And the workflow itself is exactly the same as the one we use internally, save for some granular bits and pieces linked to our own internal processes and systems. But it means that our clients are on the same page as us the whole way through, with the ability to see what's coming. So they might be able to say to us, actually, I see there's a step towards the end where you're going to ask for some data. I've got that already. Can I just send it to you? So to summarize it, without taking up too much time here, we've brought together significant improvements in the back-end processes and the front end and tied them together to make sure that we're leading the market when it comes to professional service delivery. We focused on Annex 4 today, but the digital transformation program stretches across our services, some of which are up on screen in the example. Others are linked to what Mike alluded to at the top of the session. So we're seeing already that it's adding significant value to our clients, both new and old. And on the next slide. It's just a way to contact us. If you did want to speak about any of that in more detail, very happy to talk further regarding the way our Annex 4 services are delivered, those broader services, or if you're interested in the portal and our digital work, we can get into that too. But as I said, thanks very much for joining us today. Hopefully you gained some good technical insights around Annex 4, saw a little bit about the options out there and what we can do to help as well. Thanks very much.